Hello everyone, so this is part 2 of the series on me making a Tic Tac Toe website from scratch. And in the previous video, which I highly recommend you to watch, we made the basic board with all of the pieces, and you can click on them and you can see they animate very nicely between all of the states. And in this video, we're basically going to do a whole bunch of stuff, such as actually making it so that the website detects when you have one, making the rest of the interface, and everything else. So let's just get started. So this is the code we had from the previous video, and essentially what I've done is make a 2D array that is 3x3 to keep track of all of the pieces and their values, a step variable to keep track of the variables, and then a couple functions for making the move that is called by the buttons, and also updating the board. But there's a couple of things I want to change about this to make it less confusing. So the first thing I want to change is that instead of using numbers to represent the status of boxes, I want to change it to strings so it is a little bit more clear. And also we can change something so that instead of just having one state for the empty, we have two, depending on whether it's an empty square or an empty circle, which in our case I use it to kind of hint on the next move that it would be, so that when it is square's move, it will be a square, etc, etc. So when we had that, it can be a little bit more convenient to implement some other functions later on. Instead of just typing this 9 times over, what I can do is create an array with length 3 and fill it with another array of length 3 like that. And then we fill it again with the value square empty. So if you think about it, it's basically a 2D array that has square empty for each of its 9 different values. So now that we have that done, we can change everywhere else that matters. So instead of saying this and checking it's empty, we can just say if the board equals square empty, or if the board x y is equals to circle empty. And we change that, and here instead of this +1 thing, which is kind of like a weird hack, we can just say like more clearly and use a ternary operator, which basically that says if it is even, then we go square filled, and if it's odd, we go circle filled. Great. And now here in the update board function, instead of using these cases as numbers, we can just say circle filled for this one and square filled. So for the last case, instead of just having one case, what I'm going to do is split it up into 2. So the first one will be square empty, in which we do element.className equals to box square break. And then do another case called case circle empty, in which we do the same thing and break. Great, so that's all of our cases, and we can just delete the first one. So there's a problem with our code that when you click one of them, all 3 of these change, and that's because I completely forgot you cannot create arrays like this. When you're just filling it with another array, it kind of fills the same array 3 times over, and when you change one of them, the other ones change. So one way to fix this is basically instead of filling it with an array, we fill it with like a temporary value like 0. And now what we do is use the map function, which basically takes each element of it and each element of that array and maps it, and returns a new array with the value of the result of the map. So that here will be a function which we can do with the arrow function, and this function basically returns the array. And now this won't be the same array because we're calling the function 3 different times, and each time it will return a new array and put it as one of the elements. And now you can see everything works as expected. So now all that's left to make it work is to change the placeholders. So what we can do is use the normal for loop, or if you want to be fancy, we can use something called a for in loop, which basically is just the index of each of the things. So we can just say for I in board, and for let j in board I. So what we have done is basically create I and j, I for each of the rows and j for each of the indexes. So now we have each individual box. So we can just say if board I j is equals to square empty, or it is equals to circle empty. And this way basically we check it as empty, and if it is, we change it to be the other one. So we can essentially just copy this code right here, except we of course change this for I and j, and change the filled to empty. So we can just say empty here and empty here. Now let's write a function to check if one side has 1 or not. And one option we could do is to write some algorithm that somehow checks every line. Because it is such a simple game, there's only really 8 ways you could win, whether these 3 vertical ones or these 3 horizontal ones or the diagonals. So we could actually just like input these lines in and just loop through them instead of writing some complicated function to generate the lines. So let us say function check win. And I basically just wrote this, which is an array of all of the 3 different points that could form a line. And now we can just loop through all of them by saying for let line of lines. And the for of loop is basically a kind of special loop, kind of like for in, except this time it doesn't give you the index but the element itself. And now what you can do is basically just say let A, B, and C equals to line. And this is something called array destructuring, so it kind of assigns A, B, and C to each of these different points. Finally, now we can just say if board A.x, A.y is equal to board B.x and B.y, and board A.x, A.y equals to board C.x and C.y, and A board A.x, A.y is not equal to square empty, and board A.x, A.y is not equal to circle empty. And we don't have to do it for any of the other ones, because once we know that they're equal, it kind of implies that the other ones are the same. So we just need to check that, and if we do get a result, we can just say return line. And now what we can do is essentially after the update board and everything else, we can just say if check win, and then now we can just say alert 1, like that. And you can see if I play something and it gives you an alert. Let's declare another variable that says let has 1 equals to false, and basically check for it here, so we can just say and not has 1, so we can prevent them from making further moves if we actually did win. So then we just write has 1 equals to true here. And now we're gonna make it so that everything else kind of fades out. So what we can do is essentially, instead of here we say this, we can just let win equals to check win and if win. And now what we do is we have the data for win, which is one of these lines. So let's just loop through all of the board again. So let I in board, for I in board, for let J in board I. So now we can define a variable called let is winner, for example, and then we can just say let to be false, and then we check if it is a winner and set it to true. So we can say for point of win, so each of the 3 points that is a winner, and we can just say if point.x is equal to I and point.y is equal to j. So if it is, we can just say is winner equals to true. And now when we do that, we can just say if at the bottom, if is winner, nothing happens, but if it is not a winner, we set it to the empty version. So we can just say if board I j is equal to square filled, we set it to be square empty, so box I equal to square. And then we can do the same thing for the circle. Great. And of course, for some reason I use the comparisons equals to when I shouldn't, and use this also when I should. So, oh well, let's just correct that quickly. And now we have to call the update board function again for it to actually change the elements. But this time I want to do it after a little bit of a delay, so there's an animation. So we can just write an arrow function right here and call update board in here. And we're going to give it a delay of 1000 milliseconds, or that would be a second. Now let's just try to win quickly, and you can see now everything fades out and you have your winner. Great. I have done more designing in Figma, and here's what I came up with. So essentially on the top we just have the header, Tic Tac Toe, a bunch of theme select toggles, a toggle for 1 player or 2 player, and then the title and board itself and the restart button. I'm trying to keep it pretty simple. Something interesting I want to do is make an animation where once you make a move, this doesn't just change instantly, but it kind of like slides out like this, if you can kind of see with my terrible dragging over here. And let's just get started making that. Let's define some properties. So here let's just say HTML body, and we're just going to do the generic margin 0, padding 0, width 100%, height 100%. And that's basically it for making it everything like fills the entire page. And then we're going to select the main container, which is like the outside container surrounding everything. And here we're going to do same thing with 100%, height 100%, like that. We can also give it a little bit of padding, let's say 20 pixels. Then what we can do is define display flex, justify content, and we can say space around. So basically it gives even spacing around everything. And we can also say align items center. And now when we save, you can see everything gets moved to the center. Now let us load some fonts. So let's go to fonts.google.com, which is always a great resource for fonts. And the font we're going to be using is called Poppins. To be completely honest, it's a little bit overused, but it's fine. It's still pretty good. And I believe the only ones we really need is regular, medium, and also black. These are the ones we need. Great. Now we have that, we could just get this, use the add import, because I just like that a little bit better than just using the HTML, like that. Simply go to the CSS, paste it at the top, right there, and you're done. So now we can go to the HTML and just say font family Poppins, as the background sans serif. Great. Let's work out the header section first. So we can define a tag called header. Here we can say h3 Tic Tac Toe. We can make a bunch of buttons, so we can just say div.themes container for making a div as a class theme container. And so we can say a bunch of buttons, so button dot, let's think, theme button times 5, let's say. So now we have 5 buttons. Great. Another thing we can do is make the select, so we can just say a select tag. We don't need the ID or the name for now. We probably need the ID for player select. And then here we can have an option tag. So for option value, let's say 1. So that's like 1 player. Option 2, 2 player. Great. So now you can select 1 player or 2 player. If you put the value 2 before 1, I think the default would be 2 player. Great. And now back to the CSS, we have to make this a lot better looking. So you can see now how it's horizontal. We don't want that, so we're gonna say flex direction column. And now it's vertical like you would expect. To start the header, we can just select it, and we can just say display flex also, and flex direction column. So this way we can just make it so that it aligns vertically, so we can say align items center, like that. We can select the header h3, give it a font weight a 400 probably. Let's see how that looks. Maybe 500. And I think that looks pretty good. And we're just gonna leave it like that. We can say margin 5 pixels, just to give it a little bit less of a margin. For the scene buttons, we can just say width 15 pixels, height 15 pixels. We might have to change that a little bit later. And then we can say border radius 50%, margin pixels, padding 0. Great. And you can see it looks pretty good. We probably had to increase this to be 25 instead of 15, like that. And make the border a bit different. So border will be 1 pixel solid, and then we can give an RGBA of a slightly darker color. So basically black, but opacity 0.1. Awesome, that looks pretty good. Now for the selection, what we can do is say header select, and then we give it appearance none. But other than that, we also have to say WebKit appearance none, mods appearance none. That is for Safari and also Mozilla Firefox. And now we have that, we kind of cleared the default colors, and now we can just like assign properties of our own. So we can say padding 5 pixels, margin 5 pixels, border radius, or okay, border radius 5 pixels, border would be 1 pixel solid, and we can use the accent color, which would be var color x primary. And then we can also say color for like the actual text itself, var color x primary. And you can see that looks pretty good, and we basically have our header done. And for the status here, what we're gonna do is make 2 headers, so that one is in the center and another is off screen, and then one can slide out, one can slide in, and then they swap places, and you can continue doing that basically. So what we can do is basically just create a div called div status container, and then create 2 h1s. So the first one would be called status 1, and the second one would be status 2, like that. And then we can just fill it in now with x turn. We can also say o turn, like that. We can also add a class to both of these, saying it's x and o, which determines like what color it would be. So yeah, we have that. Now onto the CSS. First of all, I think we can delete the padding here. It's not really needed, and that looks a lot better. And we can just scroll down a bit, and here we can just say dot status container, and also dot status container h1. So we want this to be kind of positioned depending on that. We don't want like the flexbox or anything, so we can actually say position here would be relative, and here would be position absolute. So let's give it a width of 100%, a height of around 50 pixels, that should probably be good, and also give it so that its overflow would be hidden, so that you can't scroll around it. And now you can see it's cut off a bit, even though it's 50 pixels, and that's because there's a bunch of margin there. And we can just say margin 0 on this h1 because it's really not needed. Then to position them at the correct place, first of all we have to align them at the center. So what we can do is use translate, and we only need to translate the x for this. So we can say translate 50%, and this 50% doesn't mean 50% of the page, but only 50% of the element. So you can see now it says middle. What we can do now is go back to the HTML and actually change it using the styles elements, because here we have to modify it kind of in the code. So for style, we'll have left equals to 50% for the first one, so that it should be exactly in the middle. And the second one, we can say style equals to left 100%, so that it's completely outside or on the side. We can also give it something like, for example, 200% to make sure it's really gone. But basically that's all we need to align this header. And let's just style this a little bit more and say font size equals to 40 pixels, or maybe 45 is probably better. And then we can say dot status, and font weight will be the 900s of borders that is possible. Great. Yep. And then what we can do is go to the H1 and also select the .x and the .o. So for the .x, what we have to do is essentially just color var x primary, and same thing for the .o. Color var o primary. And now you can see it matches all of the colors. The last thing we will need is basically make the button that says restart. So we can just give it like that. And essentially we're done. So in the styles, of course, we can just select the button, probably give it an ID of restart. Here, so when we scroll to the very bottom, we can just say hashtag restart. Background color, and then we can just say var color O, so that would be like kind of like the secondary color. And then we can just say background or padding 5 pixels, border radius 5 pixels. We can actually just say like 100 pixels, so it's completely round. Color would be the background color. I'm not sure if we define that as a variable. We have not, so let's just say our background color, that would be white for now, background color like that. And here we can also use the background color for our text color. So background color. Great. Padding, we can add more on the left and the right. So we can just say 5 pixels, 10 pixels to kind of expand it a bit. And I think that looks pretty good. We can just remove the border so it doesn't get weird. To give the restart button and the select buttons and everything else a little bit more animation, we can just reuse it from the place where we gave it to the boxes. So we can just say, instead of .box active, we can just say button active, and also comma select active, like that. And then we make a custom hover state, so we can just say a button hover select hover, and then what we can do is essentially say transform scale 1.1. And you might notice that this works perfectly, except for the fact that these buttons also scale, and if you don't want that, we can use a not selector. So you can say button that is not a box by saying button not dot box hover, and that's done. But we also need to add a transition to the button, so we can just say button dot button and select. So transition transform 0.2 seconds ease, like that. And now you can see everything kind of has a nice animation now. So one last thing before we wrap up with the design is to make the spacing correct. So ideally the board will be somewhere near the middle, with this being a little bit more spaced out. So one hack that I found that works pretty well is using spacers. So you can just give a div a class of spacer, and then you can just copy that and put it wherever you want some more space. And this, you can see it already immediately looks a little bit better. But if you go to the CSS and select the spacer and say flex grow 1, it basically expands those first so that you can see everything is spaced out very nicely. And if you don't want this to be touching the edges, what you can do is go to the main container and add the padding back. So you can say padding 20 pixels again, and you can see it obviously shifts it and scrolls it. And the way you can fix that is basically say box sizing border box. So instead of just sizing it by the content, it actually includes the padding and everything in that, and it instantly looks much better. If you want, we can actually probably increase the margins a little bit more, and I think that looks pretty good. To increase the spacing of this a bit more, we can also just increase the height of the scrolling status. So height, instead of being 50 pixels, if we say 100 pixels, that should look much better. And now we're basically done. And if you really want it to be aligned even more, you can just say style equals flex grow 2. So that now it grows a little bit more here and there, and now everything actually looks really good. So let's just work our way down, adding functionality to everything. So to start, of course, would be the theme buttons. And for now, how about we delete the other buttons and only focus on one. And for this button, we can give it unclick attribute, in which now you can click something, and when you click it, what it would do is document element. So this document element is kind of like the root element or HTML, and we can do something called set attribute. And here we can just say for example, color scheme. Actually, we should use single quotes. So color scheme, and we can say, for example, default light, like that. And to give it a color, all we need to do is just say style equals to background color. And here we can actually just paste in the actual color instead of using a variable, because once the theme changes, these themes will also change. So let's just copy the actual hex code over here, like that. In order to use this, we just need to use something called attribute selectors, which basically selects something based on an attribute. So we can just say color scheme, which is something that we set previously, and just say equal to default light, like that. And you can see when it reloads, basically all the color is gone, except now when you click on this, everything returns and you have set the color correctly. However, only for the first one, I'm just going to keep it as root, so there's a default color in the beginning. And now I have created a lot more themes. For example, here are all of them. So here's the dark version, there's a black and white version, and there's a solarized version, which I personally think is pretty good. And these are the colors. Here's the CSS. I basically just define a bunch more of these, each selecting to a different color scheme, and it works perfectly well. So now we have the color schemes done. Let's skip the player selector for now. The plan for this transition is to basically shift both of the headers to the left, so one slides out and the other one slides in. But how we're going to do it, again, you are not going to be able to generate infinite elements because that's kind of just wasteful. What I'm thinking is to basically shift them to the left as an animation, and then remove that transition and snap them back instantly. Meanwhile, changing the content of the first header to the content that was the second header, so that when you snap it back, nobody notices, except that you have quietly reverted them to the original state. You can do that operation again and again. And here's how we're going to do it. So let's create a function called update title. And this is going to have two parameters. The first one will be the title, and the second one is x, which is basically for changing the colors. So what I can do here is basically let status 1 equals to document.query selector status 1, and do the same thing for status 2. And now what we're going to do is basically say status 2 dot inner HTML equals to title, and also status 2 dot class name equals to is x, and use a ternary, so it would be x or it would be O for the color. And then what we can do is essentially give transitions to both of them. So status 1 dot style dot transition will be equals to transform 0.5 seconds, or actually not transform because we're modifying the left property. So left 0.5 seconds ease, and we can just copy and paste this for both of the elements, like that. And then what we do is shift it actually to the left. So we say status 1 dot style dot left equals to, we can just move it out of the way, so let's just say negative 50%, like that. And then we can also say status 1 dot style status 2, and then we can just copy that and say status 2 dot style dot left equals to 50, which moves it into the center, like that. So let's just open the console for a bit and just say update title hello, and let's say false to see what this looks like. And you can see it kind of just slides out like that. Now we have to make it snap back, and the way we can do it is just make a delay using set timeout, right, the arrow function, and here give it a delay of 500 or 0.5 seconds, like the same length as the animation. And now what we can do is just say, we can actually just copy this right here, and instead of using this, we just give it nothing, so we kind of remove the transition, and we also just snap it back to the original state, which would be left. The first one is 50 and the second one is 200, so it's way out of the way. And now what we do is essentially set the same thing to status 1 after status 1 has already hidden away. So we can just say title like that, and this is actually the entire function done. So now when we reload, we can say hello false, and you can see it slides in. If we do it again, you can see it kind of like slides in every single time, and it looks like there's a continuous stream of elements to the left, but there really isn't. And you can change the color, of course, and this works very nicely. So basically now we just have to check who won first, and what we can do is just say get 1 point of the win. So we can say let point equals to win the first one, or whichever one you want. And now we can just get the square at that point. So we can say board point.x point.y, and if it is equal to square, then square fails, then it will be true, or if else it's not. So we can just say is x equals to that, and now we can just call it. So we can just say update title, so it's x. If it is x wins. If it isn't, it is O wins. And of course pass in is x for the second property. That's the first place you can do it. The second place is if we say else, and then we just say update title based on each of the steps. So we can just say step divided by 2 or modulo 2 is equal to 0. If yes, then it is x turn. If else, it is O's turn. Great. Alright, several quick bug fixes. And that is, in the first place, I forgot to use let before this for loop, so it's kind of conflicting with the point here, but once you put a let here, it should be good. And now you can see that when you actually click on something, this actually works correctly. Now there's another thing, is that there seems to be this weird shadow thingy that's here, and really the reason I believe is because it is folding. The text at the side, it kind of just folds up into a line and then it unfolds when it slides here, so, or like it unwraps. So what we can do to simply fix that is to navigate here and just say something like white space no wrap, like that, so it can't wrap around the text. So now all we need to do is basically write the restart function. So we can just say function restart, and this is going to be a very simple and short function. So basically we just need to reset the board to its initial state. So we can just literally copy this line here, remove the let keyword, and we're done. We also have a couple more things, such as a step should be 0 and has 1 should also now be set to false. And that's literally it. All we need to do is call update board to reset the elements, and we're done. Now onto the HTML, we need to do go to the button and say on click restart, call that function, and that's all we need to do. So now when we say this, we say restart, everything resets. I guess one thing I forgot is to reset this, so we can say update title x turn, just like that. So now when you click something and say this, everything restarts correctly. And also, of course, true. Great. And basically now we're done, and I think we made some pretty good progress here. And I hope you have learned one or two things about CSS, JavaScript, and some other combination of just making websites. I have ignored this part for now because next video we're going to work on this and actually make an AI, probably using Minimax, where we're going to actually make like an opponent that you can play against instead of just playing with yourself. So that will be next video, and if you like this video, of course subscribe, like, and I'll see you next time.